Welcome to this new opening of the World Law Congress that will be hosted in Colombia on November 2021. This October opening session is being hosted in Miami and is chaired by Hilarie. Hilarie is an extraordinary, a very well-known attorney in the United States. She was also the president of the American Bar Association, and now she founded several years ago the Bass Institute for Diversity and Inclusion. We're going to have also a wide variety of panelists from different nationalities and different backgrounds on a very interesting topic. Basically, is how the COVID-19 is impacting gender equality. Before starting this opening session, I would like to share the sadness that the World Jurist Association we're passing, basically as a result of the sad loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her sentences, her views, her cases when she was practicing as an attorney are there, and her legacy will remain for a long time. But we were honored with spending some time with her on February this 2020, just right before the pandemic, during the ceremony award of the World Peace and Liberty Award. This distinction, granted by the World Jurist Association, has been delivered in a very few occasions. And at that time, in Washington, at the headquarters of the American Bar Association, a delegation of more than 200 people of the World Jurist Association were there. And as a matter of fact, she proved she was in a great intellectual shape at that time because we witnessed there an extraordinary dialogue of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the president of the World Jurist Association, Javier Cremades, and the immediate past president of the American Bar Association, Judy Perry Martini. And so I wanted just before continuing this opening session to quote Chief Justice Roberts. He said, "Our nation has lost a jurist of historic stature. We, at the Supreme Court, have lost a cherished colleague. Today we mourn, but with confidence that future generations will remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg as we knew her, a tireless and resolute champion of justice." Now I pass the floor to the welcoming remarks to the World Law Congress of President Iván Duque.
I am very pleased to welcome you to the beginning of the 27th edition of the World Law Congress. More than 14 opening sessions that will conclude in our cherished Cartagena de Indias next year. It is an honor for all Colombians to host for the first time an edition of this true celebration of democracy. We received this designation as a recognition of our efforts in defending the rule of law as a guarantor of freedom, order, peace, and concord in our society, precisely when we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the 1991 Constitution, as well as the bicentenary of the promulgation of the Constitution of Cucuta. The world is facing challenging times for many reasons, including the COVID-19 pandemic and its huge socioeconomic consequences. So we must strive to amplify valuable dialogues, such as those promoted by the World Jurist Association, the World Law Foundation, and other sponsors of this very important Congress. That is why I salute the design of this innovative, ongoing format that will hold these online opening sessions with free access. It will be a great opportunity to promote the strengthening of the rule of law as the fertile soil to allow the growth of well-being, development, and freedom for our citizens. I invite the international legal community to participate actively in this democratic journey, which will be held throughout the next months in top cities like Washington, Miami, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Hong Kong, and other cities around the globe. I wish you the very best during these months of knowledgeable, building, and sincerely welcome you to our country, when we will continue to work to build a better legal system and a better future for all based on the rule of law. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Diego Solana, for your remarks, and thank you, James Ginsburg. I was speaking to her yesterday, and she was very much affected. And we are working already from the World Jurist Association to organize in May a big gathering where we can remember Justice Ginsburg and her contribution, historic contribution to the rule of law and to gender equality. This is the topic of today. I want to thank particularly Hilarie Bass and her institute, the Bass Institute, because she picked the topic and she picked the speakers. She spoke to a group of world-class leaders in order to have an open discussion today whether this situation, this pandemic, this COVID has really boosted or has represented a new barrier to gender equality, where we are now. It's very important that this path open and led by Ruth Bader Ginsburg is continued by today's generation. And we need to understand where we are now. That's the objective of today's discussion. I also want to thank again the Bar Association, Barcelona Bar Association, for the technical support and their help and their friendship. And I also want to thank these extraordinary first-class speakers. So starting with Patricia Menendez, Christina Feral-Schuhl, Felicia Knaul, Christina Blacklaws, Jueza Claudia Escobar, the Dean of the Barcelona Bar Association, Maria Eugenia Gay, Catherine Gabriela Meyer, and Trace Robinson. So I pass on the floor to Hilarie, the leader of this opening session based in Miami. Thank you, Hilarie.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you, Diego, and thanks the many participants who are with us today. When the pandemic first hit, about 65% of women assumed that working from home was going to give them greater control over work-life balance. 70% of women thought that they would have greater control over their schedule. But now that we're 7 months in, what we are beginning to understand is that the demands of careers for women often take a back seat to schooling and the added responsibilities of home care. Women are being forced to cut back hours, take less responsibility, or leave the workforce entirely. And the reason for that is quite clear, because most recent studies reflect that in heterosexual two-income couples, 70% of those couples have the man as the main breadwinner. So when it comes time to make decisions about who is going to stay at home, it is typically the woman. What we also know from various studies that have been done since the pandemic started is that women are currently spending 65 hours a week on domestic labor, significantly more than the 35 hours per week they were spending pre-pandemic. We also understand that men typically grossly exaggerate their contribution to a household. 50% of men, for example, claim that they are doing most of the homeschooling, where only 3% of women report that their spouses are doing so. What we know is that opening economies without any provision for schooling and childcare has been described as a recipe for a generational wipeout of mothers' careers. We also know that there are implications for working on Zoom. 45% of women report difficulty speaking up or being heard in virtual meetings. 20% of women are feeling ignored or overlooked by their coworkers on video calls. And 20% of women report witnessing more discrimination at work since the pandemic. So we have organized a fascinating panel today of people from multiple different countries who are all going to talk about the different implications across society, both as far as the implications for women's working, for implications on domestic violence, healthcare disparities, and the like. I briefly will describe for you who will be joining us today. Patricia Menendez-Cambo is the Deputy General Counsel of SoftBank and the General Counsel of Latin American Fund, SoftBank. Christiane Feral-Schuhl is the President of the French National Bar Council and the past President of the Paris Bar. Dr. Felicia Knaul is the Director of the University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas, as well as a professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine and the chair of the Lancet Commission on alleviating the access abyss in palliative care and pain relief. Christina Blacklaws is the past president of the Law Society of England and Wales and currently a legal services ambassador at KPMG. Claudia Escobar is a commissioner of the Commission of International Experts in the Fight Against Corruption and a fellow of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Maria Eugenia Gay is the Dean of the Barcelona Bar Association. Katerina Miller is the President of the European Women Lawyers Association. And Tracy Robinson is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies and a past president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I think you're going to very much appreciate all that they bring to this panel. But before we start, we're going to show a very brief tribute video to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Receiving the World Peace and Liberty Award from the World Jurist Association and the World Law Foundation.
Ginsburg made those comments after receiving the World Peace and Liberty Award
from the World Jurist Association and World Law Foundation.
Justice Ginsburg's extraordinary achievements and impact on millions of people shall also be recognized and globally presented as an inspiration.
Part of our role, I believe, as lawyers in this wonderful country is to make sure that we follow the lead of Justice Ginsburg.
Is a woman who has distinguished herself as a jurist capable of raising her voice in defense of equal rights for women and men, human rights, and the role of law above all.
The stability of constitutional government and the continuation of respect for the rule of law rest in large part on the faith the citizens have in the integrity of their judges.
Despite strong opposition for certain powerful groups, a young attorney and a law professor named Ruth Bader Ginsburg maintained with energy her view.
Today we welcome Ruth Bader Ginsburg into this illustrious group of honored global leaders.
Vital to the rule of law in any land is an independent judiciary, judges who are not under the thumb of other branches of government to administer justice impartially.
And sometimes we even find a popular film can be a way to teach stories and lessons about democracy. As we all know in this country, in the life of Justice Ginsburg's story.
In the name of all of us who have heard her, going to congratulate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg for this well-deserved award.
Judges are human and they are fallible, because the natural state of humankind is imperfection. But despite our fallibility, it is our sacred charge to uphold the law and administer justice fairly to all persons, no matter how powerful or small.
Thank you to the World Justice Association for that incredible video. And why don't we go ahead and get started with our panelists. Let me first turn to Patricia Menendez-Cambo.
Thank you to the World Jurist Association and to you, Hilarie, for putting this panel together, as well as all the great work that you are doing at the Bass Institute to promote diversity and inclusion. So I'm quite honored to be here with an esteemed group of panelists. And what I'd like to tell people is I've been both on the law firm side as well as the company side. Gender diversity is not only a good thing, but it is something that is good for business in general. When you look at the top corporations and you focus on profitability, there is definitely, McKinsey has put out several reports on the fact that having a diversity at leadership and at all levels of an organization increases profitability for companies. From the legal profession, it is something that is daunting that still in today's world, we are not meeting the achievements or the quotas that are necessary with respect to that. The World Economic Forum, gender bias report sets forth that we will not gender parity as a whole until 208 years from now. In addition, the US would take an additional 6 or 7 years beyond the global goal. So one of the things that's important is it is the basis of this is to having a gender parity across all fields. And in the legal profession, it is very important to have diverse opinions in the debate, to uphold the law and uphold the standards. Today, from an in-house lawyer's perspective, we are definitely looking to see increased participation by women on legal representation in the matters that we seek legal representation for. And that means not only sending an RFI with a token woman or having your associates be gender neutral. It means across the board. It means in the relationship partner scenario. It means on the lead role. And it means really, working with firms that are committed to achieving gender parity. It is sad to see that in the 30 years of practice that I've been practicing, we have not advanced that much. And while the number of women entering the legal profession is on par, for gender diversity at the beginning, as the career of a young lawyer grows, the gap widens and widens. And as you get to the top or the leadership of law firms, there is a significant void. The American Bar Association under Hilarie's tutelage 2 years ago did a study on why women leave the profession. It's so hard to get women to stay in the profession, and people talk about that they want to achieve gender parity, and yet you have this pool of women that are entering the workforce, that are working for you, that law firms are training those first, second, and third years, and for some reason, they're just leaving the profession in droves. And then even at the leadership level, once you have somebody in their 40s or 50s, where it's the most productive years of a lawyer, that's where you have the greatest exodus at the end. And so when I hear about firms saying that we're committed to gender parity and that we're putting in programs and that we're doing things, I sit there and I wonder, well, what are you doing exactly to achieve gender parity? What are your goals? Because you clearly start with a group of women, and somehow in each of these law firm organizations, somehow the group just gets thinned out. And a number of my esteemed colleagues on the panel will be talking about implicit bias. But I mean, looking at your processes as to what you have, from A to Z is important to eliminate implicit bias in law firms. Most people don't think that they're biased against women. And some of the people that talk about gender parity, they think that they're really doing things to make a difference. But in reality, if you're not succeeding, that's failure. And so you got to go back, you got to look at your panels across the board. People are trying a number of different things. We look at that at our partner firms as to what programs they have and what they're doing. to try to help from that perspective. But you need, from a law firm perspective, you need the alignment to be there for women, not only from the advancement of the opportunities perspective, but also from the perspective of compensation, succession planning, and have a path to achieving that. So I always wonder when people say that, we're working towards achieving gender parity. But the reality is things that are not measured are not prioritized, and goals that have no accountability are rarely achieved in a busy market that we have today. So, I think eliminating biases from all the policies in the firm is an important way, is focusing on education, because certainly your clients understand that it's not only a good thing to do, but it's also good for business. So there has to be a way that internally within these firms, you can certainly accelerate that path to gender parity. I can think of many ways, but I think firms don't realize all the barriers that they have put in place implicitly to do that. And so for companies, those companies that are in the top quartile, when you measure the Fortune 500 companies towards gender equity, are 15% more likely to have profitability just from that than the firms that do not have that. In today's society, you have a number of countries that are putting policies in to enforce women on boards. And as a young lawyer, I always thought that quotas was not a great idea. But, after 30 years of practice and seeing that the private sector has not been able to achieve that on its own, then I think a little public policy may be helpful. And here in the US, we're testing that out in California. So when you look at it for the legal profession, you're getting signs from the business organization, business companies. You're getting policies that are written about women in the organization. You have an access of pool of women lawyers that join your firm every year. So it's, you have society supporting this. It should be something that should be easier to achieve and should not take as long as it's currently taking from that. The other thing is and when you talk about technology and listening to Hilarie's point about, the additional burden that working from home has for women, that is absolutely true. But at the same time, you need to look at it, it's also an opportunity. So women are not, have women that have issues with respect to traveling at times or relocating for business from one office to the other. If they're in a two-income family, statistically, women don't tend to move the family in accordance with their promotion for their careers. Usually the women tend to follow the men, with the exception of my good friend Jane Fraser, who did relocate her family and is now the first female president of a top bank in the United States. But Jane moved her family several times with respect to that. So one of the things that I think about today is technology. If you look at it in a post-COVID environment, we'll be able to help that, because the decisions that you have as far as relocation or promotion, we've seen that during this pandemic, technology can facilitate the participation of more women at different levels. And it also allows you, when you're thinking of putting a team together, instead of thinking of just the lawyers that you have in your office or in another group, it really does widen the horizon of resources that you have from a client perspective. So while I agree that it is a burden and that, balancing both things at home, I think the technology part of it will also open up a lot of opportunities if we're open to that and open to seeing how we can use the advancements of technology to help close the gap on gender parity.
Thank you, Patricia. Next, how about Christiane?
Hello, Hilarie. Hello, everyone. I'm Christiane Feral-Schuhl. I am the president of the French National Bar Council, the institution representing the 70,000 French lawyers. I wish first of all to thank President Javier Cremades and President Hilarie Bass, and also President Maria Eugenia Jay, for organizing a roundtable on gender equality in times of COVID-19. It is at the heart of the French National Bar Council concerns. Violence against women affects all regions, all countries, all social classes of our society. Lawyers are natural actors in this struggle as spokespersons, as defenders of victims of gender violence. Many lawyers are involved in this struggle on a daily basis in their professional practice. When they accompany women victims of violence during legal proceedings, for example, or when they assist a victim under the legal aid scheme, or when they act as pro bono. The COVID-19 crisis, and in particular the lockdown, has dramatically increased domestic violence. As we all know, being forced to live under the same roof as a violent person becomes a trap for women and for children who find themselves even more isolated and forced to remain silent. In France, according to a report which has been published by the Secretariat for Equality between Women and Men, police officers carried out 44% more interventions for domestic violence compared to the same period in 2019. To respond to this emergency, the French National Bar Council has taken concrete initiatives. Last April, the French National Bar Council set up a hotline staffed by elected members of our institution, specially trained in fighting gender-based violence. They listened, they informed, they referred victims to a territorially competent lawyer. This toll-free telephone number, accessible 24 hours a day, has been made available to pharmacists, doctors, to police, and to other law enforcement officers, and also associations dedicated to combating domestic violence. It aims to help victims through legal proceedings, particularly for being assisted during a criminal court hearing, or also for obtaining what we call a protection order. A protection order is a very useful measure. It has been introduced in French law in July 2010. It enables a victim of gender-based violence to obtain in one decision protection for herself and for her children, measures relating to the exercise of parental authority, and the location of the couple's home. Unfortunately, this order is still not thought enough in France, but it's a very good tool. These actions cannot be limited to the time of the lockdown, and this is why our institution decided to make this emergency hotline a permanent hotline. In April, our institution became a member of the French National Committee Against Domestic Violence. This committee was created at the initiative of the National Council of the Order of Physicians. It brings together various professions like doctors, pharmacists, nurses, midwives, lawyers, within, as you can understand, a multidisciplinary approach between associations and professionals to improve the initial contact and guidance of victims of violence. It is by exchanging points of view, expertise, good practices of our different professions that we will be able to make progress in this area. So to answer your question, COVID-19, it is a boon or a detriment to gender equality? I would reply, it is a detriment because lockdowns cause a marked upsurge in domestic violence. But COVID-19 is a sort of boon because it forced our institution to be more proactive, to be more creative in acting for gender equality.
Thank you, Christiane. And now we turn to Dr. Knaul.
Thank you very much, Christiane, for that incredibly important focus on gender-based violence. Hilarie Bass, thank you for leading the Board of Trustees of our university and for leading issues like this here in Miami and also globally, and to the World Jurist Association for taking this on. I want to give a special thanks and call out to Colombia, because it was there in the early 1990s that I did my dissertation work and had the incredible opportunity of participating in one of the world's truly great health reforms in 1993. So a lot of what I learned, some of what I might share today, I owe to that time in Colombia. COVID-19 is erasing decades of progress on advancing gender equality and empowerment. And the same kind of risk is what we face in health. Decades of progress improving the health of women, and therefore also the health of families, may be erased. We have to think of layers of pandemics, not shadows, as is sometimes being used to describe something like gender-based violence. Gender-based violence was a pandemic before COVID, and it will be a pandemic after, and long after we have a vaccine. There is no vaccine solution for something like gender-based violence or gender inequality or poverty. The solutions must be longer-term, structural, and institutional. And that is why many in the health field, and I'll highlight a recent editorial by Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, are calling for a very different view, to think of COVID-19 as a syndemic, a synergistic pandemic, a confluence of non-communicable diseases, poverty, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, and gender, an intersectional disaster. Think about, for example, the data that we have for the United States. These are not gender specific yet or gender disaggregated. Black and Latino Americans are roughly 2 to 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to contract coronavirus, 4 times more likely to be hospitalized, and nearly 3 times as likely to die. True disaster preparedness, and disaster preparedness is often what those in the health sector are speaking about, but true disaster preparedness would treat this and future pandemics as syndemics, and therefore have a syndemic preparedness in place. If we had done that in the past, including strong programs and stronger work on gender equality, we would not be seeing what we're seeing today. And I thought it was my role on the health side to just share today's data from Johns Hopkins coronavirus tracking system. We're seeing, as of this morning, 1,087,000 deaths, 38.2 million cases. We're projecting, according to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, 2.5 million deaths by February of 2021. And a very recent article in JAMA by David Cutler and Larry Summers give us an idea of the true economic losses, thinking only of the United States now. And they say how these are concentrated among the poor and the marginalized. For the US, they're projecting a cumulative cost of lost output and of health of $16 trillion, which is 90% of this country's annual GDP. So there is no doubt in all of this that women are facing collateral damage, and also that we can change the face of responses to this and future pandemics through a synergistic response by learning from this. And that's where I think the boon comes in. So first, what are the collateral damage around the health of women? We're seeing fractured health systems, interrupted progress to achieve universal health coverage, and therefore excess mortality for women. We're seeing evidence of divestment in maternal and child health programs that be in the face of having to support COVID-19. This sort of divestment, though, is worrisome, inappropriate, and not the right response. A recent Lancet paper by Robertson estimated that there would be very important additional maternal deaths resulting from these disruptions. In their best case scenario, we're talking about over a 6-month period, 12,200 additional maternal deaths. And in the worst case scenario, almost 57,000. These are huge percentage increases over what we had seen in the past, where we had tremendous gains in something like maternal mortality. NCDs, or non-communicable diseases, has been thought of as a tsunami or a pandemic affecting both rich and poor, and particularly virulent in the Latin America region. This is a huge problem in the face of COVID-19, and that is where we are going to see so-called excess mortality. And it will be especially poor for women. Take breast cancer as an example, and we're in Breast Cancer Month. It's an issue I work on quite a bit. We know that women are not coming forward for screening, and that they're losing access to treatment in many different parts of the world. An example from Mexico, recently put together data by a colleague, Marlis Fuentes, shows that the Ministry of Health is reporting a 23% decline in registered cases. And that's breast cancer. On cervix, over 40%. In some states in the country, 74% declines. This is not because there is less breast cancer. This is because women are not able or not willing to come forward to be able to be diagnosed. What is the answer? Protect primary health care, social protection insurance programs, and do not divest and do not cancel social protection. But also, we have the reasonable evidence that we must think about public health education and empowerment, and particularly using, for example, community health workers. I'll share just some US anecdotal data that was published in the New York Times. They surveyed data from Mujeres Unidas y Activas in San Francisco. These women did not know that they could ask for testing. They were denied protection. They reported a case of being offered coffee filters as masks. One woman confessed that she'd never taken her 4-month-old baby outside for a doctor's visit. But facilitating dialogue with these women, weaving lessons about public health, can truly change their ability to insist on what they have the right to in terms of care. Another point regarding health: women are the majority of producers of paid and unpaid healthcare around the world. Research that we did for the Lancet Women in Health Commission showed that contributions of women to health, paid and unpaid, at the very least is worth 5% of global GDP, but half of that is unpaid, so it is unrecognized and highlights the word unprotected. Caregiving is unprotected in all senses. Yet women are shouldering, not only with COVID, more of the caregiving for children and for the elderly, but also they are being thrust into positions where they are caring for those who fall ill. New York Times summarized results from Global Health 50/50, a very important think tank. They shared data from Afghanistan from a woman named Sharifa who lives in Kabul. She cared for her husband who tested positive, and in caring for him, she quickly contracted the disease. But her husband stopped her from getting a test or from seeing a doctor. And she quotes that he laughed at her when she said that she wasn't feeling well. But the data from Afghanistan are what we need to focus on. Somehow in a country like Afghanistan, we have data that suggests that 74% of deaths are among men. But that's because women aren't being tested and aren't able to come forward. Globally, we have data say 58% of deaths are among men. But again, we cannot balance that out properly because we don't know about testing and we don't have women with the same kind of access. So we will not have the jury out, so to speak, on that until we have a true calculation of how this disease has affected all, not only directly as coronavirus, but also through this kind of excess mortality affecting particularly non-communicable diseases. So curbing a syndemic requires a syndemic response that focuses not only on the infectious nature of the virus, which is COVID-19, which is what we've all been doing until now, but also the persistent and pervasive infections that stem from inequity, discrimination, neglect, and poverty, and which often find pivotal focus in gender. A syndemic lens would explore interconnections and interrelationship and must take a gender lens. There are ways that we can do this, and there are some very specific examples, and I'll give only two very briefly and then conclude. The first that I want to highlight is work also from someone from the University of Miami, Mary Ann Franks, and she is luckily participating in our Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People, led by myself and Dr. Flavia Bustreo. Mary Ann Franks' work is highlighting, and has been doing so for several years, the issue of cyber violence. But in the face of COVID-19, cyber violence is a whole new area of risk for women and for children. It's also a place where the law is key, where we need to focus on managing control and cross-border legislation, among other issues. But let's think about that flip side, the boon that Hilarie was asking us. Some of that new access to technology of information is changing the way that we can deliver healthcare for all. So the good side of this is something like telehealth and telemedicine that I believe it's finally come. There were many restrictions before, but chaos and need has changed that. And now we can think of how to make that happen. And finally, and again, to highlight the idea of true disaster preparedness in a syndemic. And so what you should not be doing is what some countries have been doing, to divest of health, to close social protection programs, but we need to look to other countries, some that have harnessed those programs, and we have some very important examples from the region. One of them, for example, found and researched by Marika Blofield, also from our university, is Argentina's Acompañar, where they're integrating efforts to support and give income protection to women who have suffered gender-based violence through large-scale social protection programs. It's time to harness information on that and spread it across countries in the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, but not only, so that we can do a gender lens and a syndemic response to this layered set of pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knaul. Very thought-provoking. Next, we have Christina Blacklaws from the UK.
Hi, Hilarie. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. In the UK, we have over 50%, 52% female lawyers. 2/3 of the new entrants into our profession have been female for the last nearly 30 years. And yet, in spite of that, we only see female partnership at about 29%. So when I was president of the Law Society of England and Wales, I was able to spearhead some research, and indeed we undertook the largest ever global survey and 250 round tables in 19 different countries and produced 3 reports. Now, I'm not in 5 minutes going to cover the outcomes and the recommendations of all of that, but I am going to focus on one of our key findings, that the biggest, the most significant barrier to women's career progression in the law was systemic bias. And it's completely unacceptable that anybody held back from fulfilling their potential because of their gender, their race, or any other protected characteristic. But our research found that across the world, women lawyers shared this experience. Social and cultural expectations about what we could and should do because we were female. And this discrimination was particularly felt by working mothers. Our research found that they were penalised for additional caregiving commitments outside of work. So that was pre-COVID. What's happened as a result of the pandemic? Well, certainly what I think has happened is that things have intensified. Hilarie spoke about some statistics. I'm going to give you some UK ones as well to support this. Our Institute of Fiscal Studies has undertaken a piece of research. and found that mothers were 47% more likely than fathers to quit or to lose their job during the pandemic. Our UK research shows that women undertake at least 2/3 of childcare. And when it comes to the law in the city, and our biggest law firms, city law firms, 25% of female partners said that they were the primary carer for school-aged children, but only 6% of male partners said that. And I have in my mind as well Hilarie's concern that sometimes that's an exaggeration. And don't get me started on intersectionality, because our research evidence that there was a huge additional barriers and burdens for women who had additional protected characteristics. So I think we could say that COVID has been dramatic and traumatic for gender equality. But what I want to focus on now is, how do we make it a boon? So how do we move from where we are to build back better? And as a technologist, I chair 2 UK government panels in the technology space. My view is that anything which disrupts the status quo has the potential to be really good for those who have been disadvantaged by it. And one of the things that I would say has been positive is we have now normalized flexible and agile working. It is something that is now mainstream. It's not a mummy track anymore. It is something that everybody has had experience of. And this was, in our research, was identified as something really key to ensure that we shift the needle in terms of gender equality. So my hope is that in our new future, when we get through this pandemic, that we can move to a more blended, hybrid way of working, which will be good for women. Be good in the sense that we can perhaps reduce part-time working. Certainly in the UK, there's a real part-time working trap for women who might work, say, be paid, for 4 days work a week and actually be working 6 days work, and also have their career progression held back because they are seen as not sufficiently committed. So if actually we can move to a much more blended way of working, then there is that possibility that women can balance their work and their life commitments and not be penalised for that. I think there's a real opportunity that we can reduce presenteeism, that jacket on the back of the chair approach, that person's in front of me and therefore I'm going to give them this good piece of work in a more blended environment. So flexible working is one thing I think is part of the future solution. Secondly, and Patty already mentioned this, but technology. I'm going to make a slightly different point though. I think that we have all got used to using different types of technology. We had them before, but now we have that experiential opportunity to utilize this technology. And that's opened up for me the possibility that as professionals we can use other types of technology. And there are some fantastic technologies out there that really support gender equality. So I'm thinking of, for example, work allocation technologies, which manage to make work allocation not only fair, but objective and efficiency based and based on competencies and availability, as opposed to who you like or who looks like you. My final thing is about business development. And I think the move away from the sort of barroom culture has given us a real opportunity to engage and network with our clients and with each other in a very different way, in a way which I think is less disadvantageous, less male-shaped, if you like, for women. So I think there's some real things to be optimistic about if we can embed these positive changes. The final thought, and this is a real challenge, is how do we build business structures, service delivery models that are actually empowering of working mothers, as opposed to our current structuring, which is you cannot even admit that you're a working mother. That has to be dealt with outside of the business model. This is really important. I do a lot of work around gender pay gap, but I'm also really exercised by the gender stay gap, by getting women to want to stay in business and therefore able to progress their careers. This is absolutely key. And from my perspective, just as I believe that values and purpose-driven businesses, businesses that have a moral compass, are going to be those that are attractive for staff and for customers alike post-COVID, I really think that businesses who can genuinely put diversity and inclusion at the very heart of their business decision making will be the ones to succeed. So with a positive thought, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And next we'll hear from Claudia Escobar.
Hola, es un gusto compartir con todas ustedes este panel y compartir algunas ideas sobre cómo podemos facilitar el acceso a la justicia para las mujeres, los niños, los grupos vulnerables. Y también quiero compartir algunas inquietudes que han surgido a partir del COVID-19 para los sistemas de justicia. Bueno, sabemos que el acceso a la justicia es parte integral del Estado de Derecho, la protección de los derechos humanos y el desarrollo humano. Este derecho se refiere a la capacidad de cualquier persona de recurrir a las instituciones de justicia para ayudar a la resolución pacífica y efectiva de conflictos individuales o colectivos, para recibir una asesoría adecuada, y también es la garantía a un debido proceso cuando se le acusa de violaciones legales. Por lo tanto, es un derecho fundamental en sí mismo, pero también es un derecho de protección para los demás derechos. El principio de acceso a la justicia y reparación legal está claramente establecido en la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos, en convenciones e instrumentos internacionales que reconocen los derechos fundamentales. Sin embargo, se estima que más de 5.000 millones de personas en todo el mundo no pueden resolver sus conflictos o reclamar sus derechos a través de ningún sistema judicial. Muchas de estas personas viven y trabajan sin un estatus legal o una protección formal, desconocen sus derechos y las opciones para involucrarse en el sistema legal, o se sienten intimidadas por la forma en que funcionan los sistemas de justicia. Son incapaces de superar estas barreras físicas, lingüísticas o financieras. Un gran porcentaje de la población mundial no puede reclamar sus derechos o buscar una reparación legal cuando se enfrentan a daños y abusos perpetrados por actores privados o públicos. Además, cuando logran superar esas barreras y presentan reclamaciones legales, las personas de los grupos marginados a menudo se encuentran con indiferencia y algunas veces incluso con hostilidad por parte de funcionarios de la administración pública. Si la situación de justicia, de acceso a la justicia, ya era un problema grave antes de la pandemia, el coronavirus solamente lo ha agudizado, como lo han mencionado algunas de las expositoras antes que yo. Durante la pandemia del coronavirus ha sido más evidente las debilidades y falencias de los sistemas de justicia en los países en vías de desarrollo. Durante esta intervención quisiera hacer énfasis en la problemática de la región de Latinoamérica que impide a las mujeres, los niños, las poblaciones indígenas y los grupos vulnerables tener acceso a la justicia. Está ampliamente reconocido que la impunidad y la corrupción alimentan la violencia en muchos lugares del mundo, como por ejemplo en los países de Centroamérica, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, por ejemplo, se encuentran entre los más violentos y con sistemas de justicia menos eficientes. Los conflictos que no son resueltos tienen repercusiones negativas para el bienestar económico, social y político de las personas y de las comunidades. Las organizaciones de monitoreo de derechos humanos y de justicia han subrayado repetidamente cómo la falta de una respuesta efectiva a los hechos de violencia alimenta su recurrencia a nivel macro y micro. En el informe de Justice for All, del report de Task Force on Justice del 2019, se señala que quienes tienen problemas de justicia sin resolver pierden un promedio de un salario al mes y a menudo sufren daños en su salud física y mental. Estos problemas tienen un costo económico. Según la OCDE, es dentro del 0.5 y un 3% del PIB anual y más del 2% del PIB en los países de bajos ingresos. Por otra parte, la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, en el informe El acceso a la justicia como garantía de los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, resaltó el carácter positivo de esta obligación. No solo en tanto genera en los estados el deber de crear de estos recursos, sino también en tanto los obliga a organizar la institucionalidad estatal para que todas las personas puedan acceder a ellos y a remover toda clase de obstáculos que estén impidiendo o limitando la posibilidad de su realización. El derecho internacional de los derechos humanos ha desarrollado estándares sobre el derecho a contar con recursos judiciales y de otra índole que resulten idóneos y efectivos para reclamar por la vulneración de los derechos fundamentales. En tal sentido, la obligación de los estados no es solo negativa, de no impedir el acceso a esos recursos, sino que es fundamentalmente positiva, de organizar el aparato institucional de modo que todos los individuos puedan acceder a estos recursos. A tal efecto, los estados deben remover los obstáculos normativos, sociales o económicos que impiden o limitan la posibilidad de acceso a la justicia. La obligación del Estado de facilitar el acceso a la justicia es extremadamente importante en momentos de emergencia, como el contexto de la pandemia del COVID-19, que ha generado nuevos obstáculos para el acceso a la justicia. La Corte Interamericana, en su opinión consultiva sobre garantías judiciales en estados de emergencia, ha indicado que el derecho de acceso a la justicia no puede ser suspendido durante estados o situaciones de excepción. En concordancia con ello, los organismos internacionales de protección de los derechos humanos han advertido la importancia de que los sistemas de justicia no se paralicen. En esa misma línea, el 10 de junio del 2020, la Comisión Europea para la Eficiencia de la Justicia y el Consejo de Europa emitió la declaración Lecciones aprendidas y desafíos para los poderes judiciales durante y después de la pandemia del COVID-19, que contiene 7 principios cuya finalidad es proveer de guía a los estados en un periodo de crisis que impacta los servicios públicos de la justicia. Todos los principios enunciados constituyen lineamientos importantes para que los sistemas de justicia nacionales puedan tomar decisiones adecuadas en la adaptación de sus servicios. Respecto al acceso a la justicia, han indicado que debe garantizarse a todos los usuarios, pero en tiempos de crisis se debe prestar una mayor atención a los grupos vulnerables, quienes están en mayor riesgo de sufrir con esa situación. Por tanto, los sistemas de justicia deben dar prioridad a los casos que interesan a estos grupos, como los casos de violencia doméstica, en particular contra mujeres, niñas y niños, aquellos que involucran a personas adultas, mayores o personas con discapacidad que están en una grave situación económica. Deben considerarse también las vulnerabilidades generadas como consecuencia de la pandemia. A su vez, la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos también ha manifestado en el punto resolutivo 16 de la resolución 01-2020 sobre pandemia y derechos humanos en las Américas que los estados deben asegurar la existencia de mecanismos de rendición de cuentas y el acceso a la justicia ante las posibles violaciones de derechos humanos. Quisiera en esta oportunidad hacer énfasis a un informe que un grupo de 12 organizaciones civiles y personas defensoras de derechos humanos representativas de 10 países de la región presentamos ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en la audiencia pública el 8 de octubre del 2020 celebrada para exponer el derecho de acceso a la justicia y las obligaciones de los estados respecto al funcionamiento de los sistemas de justicia durante la pandemia. Nos hemos tomado varios meses pues para observar cómo los sistemas de justicia estaban respondiendo a estos desafíos y identificamos que muchos de los países de la región no han incluido a los servicios de justicia como un servicio esencial. Y por tanto, en algunos lugares, desde que se inició el confinamiento, se cerraron los juzgados, las cortes, se suspendieron la mayoría de los servicios relacionados con la justicia de los ciudadanos. En otros, el servicio fue parcial, dependiendo del área, y en algunos se hicieron ajustes para evitar el contagio, pero aún no están funcionando en su capacidad total. Es necesario que los estados reconozcan el carácter esencial del servicio de justicia durante la pandemia, no solo la protección de los derechos y libertades fundamentales, sino también para el control de los actos del poder público durante esta etapa. La continuidad del funcionamiento de la justicia es esencialmente importante en este contexto en el que observamos riesgos crecientes y amenazas importantes de la estabilidad democrática de nuestros países. La reactivación de la justicia y la adopción de medidas efectivas para que sea accesible en medio de la pandemia es urgente. Y pese a su urgencia, no se encuentra en el debate público ni en las prioridades de los estados. A pesar de distintos esfuerzos, algunos de mayor intensidad que otros, durante la pandemia se han observado diversos obstáculos que han limitado significativamente el acceso a la justicia para grupos que se encuentran en situación de vulnerabilidad. En general, los sistemas remotos que se venían utilizando o se han adaptado todavía enfrentan desafíos para su plena operación, pero además presupone que las personas tengan acceso a medios electrónicos y conocimientos tecnológicos para poder acceder a la justicia, lo cual se vuelve casi imposible en países donde no existe una amplia brecha digital. Se identificaron 13 desafíos comunes en los países de la región, entre los cuales destacan los siguientes: invisibilización de la situación de la justicia en la agenda pública de la pandemia. Limitación de acceso a la justicia para grupos vulnerables. Inexistencia de información objetiva, actualizada y útil acerca de la carga procesal acumulada como consecuencia de la suspensión de plazos y actuaciones procesales que impiden una adopción estratégica adecuada para atenderlas. El presupuesto que se necesita para estas asignaciones no ha sido otorgado por los estados. Existe también una nula rendición de cuentas. Casi de forma generalizada, los sistemas de justicia de la región no han rendido cuentas frente a la ciudadanía acerca de las medidas que han adoptado durante la pandemia, así como sobre los resultados obtenidos durante esta etapa. Hay una afectación también a los derechos laborales de operadores de justicia en algunos casos. Hay incumplimiento de decisiones judiciales emitidas durante la pandemia que otorgan protección a derechos y libertades básicas. Y hay afecciones a la independencia judicial bajo la forma de amenazas, hostigamientos y estigmatización contra operadores de justicia desde otras instancias del poder. Vemos que por muchas décadas las reformas del sector judicial en los países en vías de desarrollo se han centrado en cambios estructurales y de procedimiento destinados a mejorar la independencia y el profesionalismo judicial. Ambos aspectos son fundamentales para construir el Estado de Derecho, pero son insuficientes. En los países en desarrollo con altos niveles de desigualdad o de pobreza, hay millones de personas que no tienen acceso a la justicia, lo cual no solo les dificulta proteger su propiedad y reclamar sus derechos, sino que también puede alimentar un círculo vicioso de conflicto y de violencia. Para combatir estos problemas, las reformas legales y judiciales deben basarse en la diversidad y la inclusión, con el objetivo de hacer que el Poder Judicial sea más accesible para todos los ciudadanos, especialmente para las poblaciones más vulnerables. Desde el punto de vista institucional, es recomendable, primero, que se diversifique la judicatura para reflejar mejor en términos de género y étnicos la composición de la sociedad. También es importante institucionalizar la formación en diversidad en los planes de estudio, en las escuelas de derecho y en los sistemas de justicia. Y en el ambiente de la divulgación, es necesario que se promuevan mecanismos que acerquen el sistema de justicia a la ciudadanía, no solo física y económicamente, sino también a través de la educación y los servicios que contribuyan al empoderamiento legal de los grupos marginados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And next we have Maria Eugenia Gay from the Barcelona Bar.
Thank you, Hilarie. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the president of the World Jurist Association and to the former president of the American Bar Association, my friends Javier Cremades and Hilarie Bass, for giving me the opportunity to participate and share this virtual space with such distinguished panelists, some of them good friends, and as well as the city of Miami for hosting this opening session. Thank you very much, Hilarie. Dealing with the effects of the pandemic from a gender approach is an essential issue because, as shown by United Nations Women, an entity that recently commemorated its 10th anniversary, health and humanitarian problems have greater impact on the most vulnerable groups, such as migrants, ethnic minorities, the elderly, or the homeless. Women are the ones who have suffered most of the socioeconomic consequences of the crisis at the global level, due to a structural problem of inequality and unresolved that has its origin in gender-based allocations, which even today, despite 25 years after the Beijing Declaration, still occur in a multiple spheres of lives that you explained. In the work sphere, women continue to suffer greater precariousness in various ways that it is unacceptable, that more of them were mentioned for you. For example, the incomprehensive salary gap with the same level of responsibilities. Christina knows that because of the result of the studies that she did. The so-called glass ceiling, it's incredible, the situation we are living. Or the underrepresentation of women in decision-making positions and management bodies, both in private companies and public entities. Likewise, in the sphere of family relationship, women often appear in a clear subordinate position with respect to men because of a patriarchal society full of sexist stereotypes that only aggravate inequality in times of crisis. In this sense, women are the ones who usually decide to, in the family interest, reduce working hours or ask for a leave of absence to take care of children of a family member. Still in the 21st century, these tasks are far from being treated under the necessary perspective of co-responsibility, by virtue on which all members of the family unit must assume the distribution of such tasks under equal conditions. I think that the role that women continue to assume as main caregivers, both at the work and family level, means in times of COVID-19, greater exposure to the disease with serious consequences. Also at the professional level, due to the influence of mechanisms that take into account the workload they assume personally. When the state of alarm was declared in our country, in Spain, remote working quickly increased from 4% to 33%, making it possible for many companies to continue their activity, even despite the drastic health measures forced by the situation. This system has revealed numerous advantages. As you explained, most of you talk about that, over the last few months at a social level, such as the preservation of the environment, the inclusion of workers with reduced mobility, or the fact of constituting a true claim for the attraction of talent where distance is not an obstacle. Certainly, this could be a good opportunity to enhance smart cities or even correct the depopulation of some territories, improving the economy with the boom of new sectors. On an individual level, remote working has also served to combine the care of children while the restrictions in school have lasted, in addition to have been an excellent test bed to organize the provision of the labor service in a much more dynamic way, with efficiency and productivity criteria, having a positive impact on companies who have been able to accelerate a modernization process that today I think is essential in the framework of the digital age. However, the unequal assumption of responsibilities between men and women has also been present in working remotely to the detriment of women, who during the confinement have expressed greater difficulties in preserving a workspace that allowed them to distinguish between their professional and personal life. And this represents a greater fatigue. in both physical and psychological compared to men, which generates stress in women because they do not have, on many occasions, sufficient support from their own work environment and at the institutional level in order to avoid the justified fear of losing their job and the difficulty of finding a new one similar to the one they had before. For this regard, remote working as an instrument that has come to stay with us must be considered from a gender perspective and be accompanied by measures that have equality and co-responsibility as the main axis in order to avoid the mentioned situations. Equality is a fundamental right, closely related to people's dignity, reason why civil society, we, civil society, must demand from governmental powers its promotion as a cross-cutting principle that inspires public policies, ensuring parity and equality at all levels. Precisely for this reason, one of the program highlights of the current Council of the Barcelona Bar Association has been developed its Equal Plan. We think that empowerment of women and the promotion of female talent are now more necessary than ever, since gender equality goes beyond a question of ethics and justice. In this sense, let me finish with the words of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose legacy, after her recent death just a month ago, we must continue until we make equality an unquestionable reality without exceptions. Women will have achieved true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugenia. Appreciate it. Next, Katerina Miller.
Yes, also from my part, thank you so much to the World Jurist Association, Hilarie, to you for your fantastic organization, to Javier, and also to Maria Eugenia. Un big beso desde Madrid. I would like to share a presentation with you, and you should now see my fantastic presentation on domestic workers. Is this the case?
Yes.
Super. Okay, so there is some important data to share with you on domestic workers. Of course, when you talk about domestic workers, the first thing to have a look at is the International Labour Organization, ILO, which estimates that there are 67.1 million domestic workers around the world, with 11 million of these workers to be migrants. I will come back to this, why this is important a little bit later. Domestic workers perform work in or for a household with roles to perform household tasks and provide personal assistance to the person who pays for this work. And these tasks include cooking, cleaning, garden maintenance, and taking care of children. The nature and type of work done by domestic work is undertaken within the private sphere, and therefore governments are resistant in regulating the issues surrounding domestic workers, which can be a problem. More than half of all domestic workers have no statutory limitations of their working hours. This means that the working hours domestic workers take can be long and unregulated. 2 out of 5 domestic workers are not entitled to be paid a minimum wage, and many of these workers are paid below the minimum wage, which affect their ability to save during COVID-19. 29% of domestic workers are excluded from labor legislation, with the consequences of not being considered regular workers. Therefore, these workers are very vulnerable to unfair dismissals that cannot be challenged. 83% of domestic workers are women. Women are vulnerable to consequences of not having social and economic rights, such as human trafficking, sexual slavery, and fears of deportation. More than a third of these women have no right to maternity leave. So, and what does this have to do with COVID and domestic workers? Well, the key problems, areas which we have been identifying are the following. Domestic workers' eligibility for Social Security with a decrease in employment available. That means that many of these domestic workers, and especially women, have not been able to get any social security because they don't pay into any social security system. The effects of lockdown laws and social distancing affecting the movement of the domestic worker in the European Union. So many of these women domestic workers were not able to go to the households to work there because they were either it was forbidden and then they would not get paid. And the third problem, the effects of the domestic worker status, immigration status, when there are travel restrictions. That means I want to give you a case that I actually was monitoring of a lady, a migrant lady from Moldova, which was working in Madrid. And Moldovan people don't have permission. They're not part of the European Union, and they don't have a work permission that is longer than 3 months. So this lady arrived in Madrid, let's say in December, and was supposed to go back to her country, to Moldova, in March. But in March, in Madrid, we had our lockdown. So this lady was not allowed to go back to her country. She was not allowed to work. She was not allowed to get any employment. She didn't have any money to pay her alimentation, nothing. And she was also not being official part of Spanish Social Security. So you can imagine the drama. What can be done? Well, I personally think that we have a fantastic convention, the ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers. This ILO Convention gives protection to domestic workers from abuse, harassment, and violence in the Article 5. It allows fair terms of employment, decent working conditions, and living conditions, protect domestic worker privacy, according to Article 6. Workers are informed of terms and conditions of employment according to Article 7. The sad thing is, and that is now a call to France, Christine and Maria Eugenia, Spain and France have not yet ratified the ILO 189, and we are the countries that employ the highest number of domestic workers in European Union. So I think we could do something about this. And in Spain, especially in Spain, more than 600,000 persons work as domestic workers, and 88% of domestic workers are women. This according to a survey in 2017. This was my short overview over domestic workers. Thank you very much for listening. Especially thank you to my research assistant of the Berkeley Center of Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law, Paul Hong. Because during COVID, we have been starting a research thinking that domestic workers is a topic which we want to focus on because there's a lot to do. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Katerina. And next, Tracy Robinson, please.
Thank you so much, Hilarie, and thank you to the World Jurist Association and everybody who has participated and all who are joining us, so greetings to all. I thought I would join the conversation by speaking briefly about gender and global leadership during the COVID crisis. And by any measure you take, when you look at who holds the highest executive positions in the world today, crisis or not, it's a man's world. Men rule as heads of government in about 90% of all the world's states. And in talking about gender and global leadership, I've noticed what I've been calling kingification during the crisis throughout and around the world. And let me just quickly share one slide with you to explain what I mean by this. And so you can see the slide in which I'm suggesting that when we start talking about gender and global leadership, you begin to see the connection of a range of factors before the crisis, with the crisis, and particularly that countries that already had strong executive leadership, concentration of power in the executive, in a prime minister or a president, invariably male, that structural element gets now joined with populist leadership, and we can think of places like this, and then comes the crisis. And with the crisis comes an unprecedented delegation of lawmaking to the executive, and also a somewhat reduced oversight of parliaments and courts. And the result looks very much like images from the past of ruling kingdoms. A maximum leader calling for loyalty of citizens and those who live in the country, forms of authoritarianism, frankly, rejection of critique of the state, manipulation of public anxiety, and evisceration of democracy, costing us our safety, our lives, and our health in the process. So to just come back to what I'm calling this kingification process, I think that we should not cleanse gender from analysis of it. We shouldn't ignore the relationship between the normalization of male leadership and patterns of authoritarianism and populism, which we see acutely so in the COVID pandemic. While the crisis pushed us to question the normalization of certain patterns of masculine leadership, I think productively it's also generated some questions about the quality and nature of women's leadership, women's global leadership during the crisis and its implications. It's been argued that women leaders around the world responded more quickly, more decisively, recorded fewer deaths. In some US states, it's been noted that states run by women governors have had more positive responses to their stay-at-home orders than others. Though still, frankly, the jury's out on the difference made by women's leadership in the effective management of the crisis. There are only a small number of women-led countries, which limits meaningful comparisons, and most of the women-led countries are disproportionately in higher income states, and maybe what we could call higher consensus states as well. And so the COVID-19 crisis may be as much about the societies that produce women leaders as the women leaders themselves. That said, I think we should pay attention to the kinds of analysis that are happening around the world about why some women have come to be seen as more favored and effective leaders during crisis and uncertain periods. Their willingness to adopt more democratic styles of leadership is said to increase, as one group of researchers put it, information sharing, to generate more diverse ideas, to promote consensus building. It's been suggested that women leaders have offered more effective communications during the crisis, showing more empathy and confidence, and thus inspiring those who are critical to ensuring and addressing that the crisis is dealt with. Women are said to have been better able to rally key stakeholders in implementing an effective response. And I certainly see some of this in one of the leaders who you may know little about, Barbados's Mia Mottley. She's the only woman head of government in the Caribbean region. And it's not simply that she closed the borders at a particular time or implemented certain measures, but it was also her ability, or is her ability, to generate confidence, goodwill, and trust, utilizing the language of care, collaboration, continuous communication that appears to have been honest, acknowledging some missteps and the need to work together. All of these seem to have made some difference in Barbados. She introduced initiatives which are very much premised on care beyond the state, and Adopt a Family initiative in which better faring Barbadians could assist and support those who were struggling, and Barbadians joined this program. She commissioned a song from musicians for the country to rally those in the country in the crisis, and she recognized, to use her words, that this was a health crisis, but she needed to, and the state needed to, offer inspiration, motivation, and respite for all. Women like Motley are imperfect leaders. Women are not offering perfect leadership, but I think the key feminist insight for me is that charismatic leadership that inspires and motivates in a crisis can also be characterized by executive restraint, by collaboration and care, and can avoid populism and avoid manipulating the emotional contagion you see in crisis. that this discussion about ethical and transformational leadership in the world today is talking about gender does not shift fundamentally, I think, all the concerns which we have about gender equality, but it does add some value, I think, to the continuing fight we have to address gender and all forms of inequality in the world today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you to all of our panelists. There's not one of you that I wouldn't love to engage in a further conversation for another hour, because so many of the issues raised, whether it's about female leadership or domestic workers or domestic violence or health equities or implicit bias, are all topics that are so central to this issue. So we had hoped that we would be able to open it up for questions, but we've really run out of time. So I would suggest that to the extent anyone has written questions, please feel free to email them to either me or Diego, and we'll do our best to distribute them appropriately to the panelists to see if we can get you a written response. But please join me in thanking our phenomenal panelists, Tracy Robinson, Katerina Miller, Eugenia Gay, Claudia Escobar, Christina Blacklaws, Dr. Felicia Knaul, Christiane Feral-Schuhl, and Patricia Menendez-Cambo. We are hoping to utilize a panel very similar to this at the Cartagena meeting coming up in November. We look forward to having as many of you attend that conference as possible. And it's going to provide a really incredible opportunity to spend some more time and focused in more detail on these important issues that impact the rule of law. So again, thank you, Diego, and thank you, Javier, and everyone else who participated in putting this panel on today. I look forward to an ongoing discussion with each of you about these topics, and please keep an eye on your emails. The World Jurist Association will be doing a monthly panel similar to this each month between now and the Cartagena meeting in November of 2021. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in Cartagena.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Hilarie. You have done a tremendous work. One of the best panels is the third opening session. You were pointing out that we are all on the way to Cartagena, November 2021. But the next stop will be in Washington, D.C. from the American States Organization. We will have a wonderful panel on human rights. I want to thank all our panelists. It's incredible to see how many barriers we still have to gender equality. And for me, the conclusion is as COVID is not a boost, but it's a new barrier. And we need just, we need not to stop, just to cope together and work together and try to identify this either from social workers, family workers, gender equality in law firms. You know, it's a real challenge for the whole society, not just in the third world and the second world, but in any of our spheres of life, including US, Europe, and the most developed countries, where we still have to remember, as Maria Eugenia said, some of the key messages of our leader, Ruth Ginsburg. So thank you very much. And I hope that we can gather together again in November for another discussion. And you, all our panelists, please feel part of this family of the World Jurist Association and our goal to promote rule of law all over the world as the only alternative for the rule of man, for the abuse of power, and for the gender equality. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.